problem is that people translated it from ancient Hebrew to Latin to Greek and all these other languages, and eventually to English. Like, a lot's lost along the way, right?
What's up, my friends? I pray you're standing strong in your faith. So this channel exists to help you guys do three things, essentially. Number one is look at a bad take, a bad argument that somebody gives on behalf of Christianity, and learn how to argue well. Number two is to red flag false teachers so that you don't fall prey to empty philosophy. And number three, that you're able to reality check opposing worldviews to biblical Christianity. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be actually reality checking Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan does not profess to be an atheist. So I want to be clear, this is not bashing him or dissing him or anything like that. I like a lot what he has to say. He seems to be a very common sense, rational guy. But of course, I oppose a lot of his Gnosticism and his skepticism, and of course, rejecting Christianity. But there's a lot of stuff on his channel. If you've been following him and listening, he brings in some really good guests, and some of them are friends of mine who give the existence, arguments for the existence of God, or showing him archaeological discoveries that validate what the Bible actually teaches, and other things. So I like the fact that he's very receptive and open. And so as we reality check this opposing worldview that he actually has, you will be able to respond winsomely and rationally. So let's dive right in and let's see. The first thing that he has to say is in this interview. It has to deal with the ancient languages. Take a listen.
With the Bible is that we don't speak ancient Hebrew. Like, maybe Ari could read that but that's the original Bible, unless you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is Aramaic. So like, if you're reading the Bible, you would have to understand ancient Hebrew, and ancient Hebrew is a completely different kind of language because the letters are also numeric. So like, the letter A is also the number 1, so they don't have a difference between letters and numbers. So like, when you say something, it has a numeric value.
I can't wait to read.
Okay, it's actually kind of funny what the guy says, but I don't want to focus in on that. One thing I want to look at as we reality check this is notice what he said is that we can't understand the Bible because we don't read Hebrew. And one of the things he says in the interview as well is that nothing was written down, and so we just have things that were orally transferred or, conveyed to other people through time. And so how do we even know what we have in the Jewish scriptures, what Christians refer to as the Old Testament? And of course, we'll get into the New Testament. But I want to say something right out the gate as we reality check this whole thing. And again, Joe Rogan does say he's an expert, but this is the problem sometimes when you have somebody like a big voice like that making these type of claims, and he clearly doesn't really understand what textual criticism, what we have when you look through the history of transmission. So let's go back 1500 BC approximately to about 400 BC. And what we actually have is we have in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we have events that were actually written down in Hebrew with portions of Aramaic. And that was done over many centuries. So we have a bunch of copies as a result of that. Another thing to respond in reality checking what he said was that in actual fact, God told Moses to write things down. And other writers who were inspired by God, including leaders and kings and prophets. Now, again, someone like him, he can question whether or not God told him because he doesn't know if God exists or not. But the reality is we actually have in antiquity tons of manuscripts that are written down. I'm gonna show you guys some of the writing materials that they used. So when you add these things together, these writings, you see them on leather scrolls. You have other materials, and they're made up of the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament. Now, when you go back, okay, the languages that were recorded in Jewish scriptures, okay, the Bible, the Old Testament, they come from the Semitic family of languages. Now, prior to the Semitic language, you have the Sumerians, and we have cuneiform. This is talking about 3000 plus BC. So this idea that we had nothing written down prior to Moses, the Hebrew scriptures, is false. Matter of fact, when you look at the Sumerians, it's the mother of the ancient biblical languages. And so the Semitic ushered in the Hebrew and the Aramaic, also known as Syriac. That ancient Aramaic or Akkadian is what we actually have today. And this is amazing when you put these things in context. So when you get into the Latin and then the Greek, they represent what is known as the Indo-European family. So the Phoenicians, they played a key role in the transmission of the Bible by providing an easier alphabet so people could better understand it as they were not only formulating a new language in the new empire, but also taking ancient documents, in this case, the Hebrew scriptures, in some cases written in some form of Aramaic. And they were able to translate that into the Persian Empire. Now, if you go back to the Hebrew and the Aramaic or the Semitic languages, remember, this goes back to Noah's son Shem. This is where this originated from. So now fast forward, when you have Aramaic, this began to replace ancient Hebrew. So after the exile in the 6th century BC, the Aramaic became that language, that ancient language, it became the common language throughout the Persian Empire. This is now, my friends, where we get the Targums from. So now we have Hebrew scriptures to Targum. So this idea of saying, well, we can't understand the Bible because it was written in Hebrew and then it was just hijacked from that point on is absolutely false. I hate to break it to Joe Rogan, but when we reality check that statement he made, we have tons of documents through the transmission and transliteration from Hebrew to Aramaic to have these Targums that have been translated that are very accurate, that we can understand what the ancient original writers intended in their native tongue. Aramaic was the language of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persian empires. When you get to Alexander the Great, this is now where Greek ushers in as he went far east into expanding his empire into India. The Greek became the common language. This goes back to 1400 BC, known as Crete, or koine, that meant common, that became the common language that people did business. They made deals. We have this contractually written down on many forms of material of antiquity. So the Septuagint now comes into play. This is about 250 to 200 BC. So you have Hebrew scriptures, you have the Targums in Aramaic, to now you have the Septuagint, and this was during the subsidized rulers of the Egyptian rulership of Ptolemy II, and is known as the LXX. So not only do we have a third translation that's coming forth, but you're able to compare it to the original Hebrew scriptures, and this was being preserved for over 2,000 years in Greek. So you may not be able to understand Hebrew and read Hebrew, even Greek, but we know based on all the material. Let me give you guys an example. If we go back, I'm going to show you guys a couple things. Transmissions, when you're looking at ancient writing of material, we have wood, we have osirka, you have the papyrus, the wax tablet wood, you have vellum, which came from animal skin, that was parchments, which was higher quality. So later, we're going to see when it comes to the New Testament, you have paper. So one thing we can do is we can trace back to these, when we're talking about things of antiquity, writings of antiquity, we're looking at the material in which they're written on and how they're written on, what they're used. Okay, was it a pen or was it chisel? Was it on tablets? Was it on stone? Was it on papyrus? So this is an indication to how far back we can go with these languages. So when you actually look at Hebrew and it's then Aramaic comes into place, and we have the Targums. Again, anyone who's a linguist can understand what not only the root meaning was, but what the author intended in their native tongue, in the original language. So this idea that we can't understand, again, is not consistent to what we actually have, to when we have now Koine Greek and Aramaic, which was the spoken language at the time. So these people were able to know what they had in front of them, that it was accurate. So the manuscripts from the Talmudic era that goes back to 300 BC to 8500. You have what's known as the synagogue rolls. These are known as sacred copies. And these scribes, these copyists, they preserved ritualistically. They followed a customary tradition. And there were these private copies that the public obviously didn't have access to. But these sophists, they had access to them. That's where Sophrim, their word for word counts. They were ensuring the preservation of the ancient text known as the Jewish scriptures. So if you go out of this period of time, they knew Hebrew, they knew Aramaic, and now they know Greek, okay? They were ensuring the proper transmission. So when you now get to the Masoretic texts, which is roughly about 8916, this is known as the transmitted or handed down. So when you now compare the Masoretic texts, which we had before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1946, you're able to take the Masoretic text, that is the 9th to 11th century, and compare it with the Essenes in the Qumran community who left after captivity when Jerusalem was ransacked. They didn't want to have anything to do with that. They wanted to preserve the Jewish scriptures in Hebrew, in their native tongue. So this was discovered, my friends, in months and years after. There is a massive amount of manuscripts that they have discovered. So these are things, when we're putting these things into perspective, it is very important for us to understand that we don't buy into some of these things that Joe Rogan says and we can't understand it and all these people believe him, when in fact we have an overwhelming evidence, my friends. When you look at papyrus, parchments, and vellum, we're able to trace the era in which these things were transmitted and compare the earlier documents that we have in manuscripts to the older ones based on whether they're written on sheep or goats, which is parchment, or we see multiple copies thousands of years later removed to compare them. So let me give you an example. The oldest fragment of the Hebrew Bible that we have until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered is known as the Nash Papyrus, and it contains the 10 Commandments in the Shema. And we're talking, my friends, about 1st and 2nd century BC. And it was discovered in Egypt in 1902. Okay, so I mentioned two other previous ones, the Dead Sea Scrolls that were preserved and protected by the Essenes. They were known as the Children of Light. And they lived out in the desert, known as the Qumran community by the Dead Sea. Now, when you take the Masoretic text, as I mentioned earlier, known as the Masorah, that means literally that which is transmitted or that which is handed down. We are talking about over 1,000-year gap, okay, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. In the Hebrew, from the textual tradition of the European Jews, these rabbis, they were known as the Masoretes. It's amazing that they were, in fact, preserving the Old Testament from the corruption of the Babylonian captivity. And all of a sudden, as the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, perfect match. 28 complete scrolls, 100,000 fragments, and 875 other partial manuscripts. And when you compare the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Septuagint, remember, from Hebrew to Aramaic, the Targums, to the Septuagint in Greek, to the Masoretic texts, they're amazingly consistent. One last thing on this whole thing, and I'm going to show you another video. This is how we reality check, my friends, these false things that oppose Christianity. When you look at the Masoretic Hebrew text, again, like I said, AD 916, and you compare it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have a copy that is about that was written about 150 BC. Remember, so that's about 600 years removed from when Isaiah spoke these prophecies and they were written down. And guess what we find? Remember, the Masoretic Hebrew text. So Hebrew is still being transmitted through the course of the Jewish people. And we have a perfect match when it was 1,000-year gap. That, my friends, is amazing. All right, so let's now do this. Let's go into the second video to reality check what Joe Rogan says here.
When you're talking about the Bible, right? And the lessons in the Bible, isn't part of the problem is that people translated it from ancient Hebrew to Latin to Greek and all these other languages, and then eventually to English. Like, a lot's lost along the way, right? And a lot is open to interpretation. Like, a lot of what we're talking about in these myths and stories that people take as factual occurrences, they probably were some sort of there's some sort of a lesson in the myth, some sort of allegory. There's things about these stories that probably have hints of truth, but isn't it hard to kind of decipher it all? If you can't.
Right. So the bottom line is it's about deciphering, he says, because again, how they've been transmitting, and they're not been accurate. So go back to what I was just saying earlier about from Hebrew, that came from the Sumerians to the Semitic language, etc. We have historically, my friends, when it comes to textual criticism, when it comes to historiographical testing of what we have, it's amazing. It's fascinating. And I wish I can tell you more about that, but I want to keep this video as short as possible. But I definitely, on this channel, I'll dive a little bit deeper. And if you want to leave a comment in there saying, hey, I like to explore more about the understanding of the history of the Bible, how it came to be, I'd be glad to do that. But let me just say this in closing. If you now look into the New Testament, so now we're talking about 80 before 80, 90, okay? Revelation being one of the last book in the canon of Scripture, the 27 books. And you fast forward into 80, 1500, let's say, in church history, when you already now have about almost 200 years from John Wycliffe's partial translation into English. This is what's so amazing, my friends. We have in the new covenant, known as the New Testament, we have the canonicity of Scripture. We have the church fathers who came after, particularly if you want to talk about the church fathers that came right after the apostles, okay? The patristic fathers following that. So these are known as the apostolic fathers. They're just one generation after the apostles into the patristic fathers, people like, Tertullian and St. Athanasius, which I'm going to mention in a minute. What we have to understand is prior to all of this, there's a lot more things that are being written down. But one of the things that Joe Rogan does to refute, and this is something that comes from people like Dr. Bart Ehrman, the professor over at Chapel Hill, is they dismiss oral traditions, and they think it's like playing the telephone game, which is totally bogus. It's totally false. Dr. Vincent Taylor wrote a classic book called The Formation of the Gospel Tradition. And what he does is Dr. Taylor, he looks into the strength and number of eyewitnesses, as well as the recollection of the teachings of Jesus. And when you go back to the Jewish custom that was built all the way from their ancestors, the Hebrews, about oral tradition, here's the catch. And this is what we have to get out of our mind, people like Joe Rogan. This is what we have to reality check. They not only second guess, it's not as so much them questioning, but they reject it entirely, because in the West, we don't build our system of education on oral tradition. In some aspects, we do about how we carry certain traditions on and not have it written down or on our phone. But to be dismissive of oral tradition and that custom in the East, we have to understand their tradition. So oral tradition is not determined by individual memories. Catch this, but by collective ones. See, they don't say that. Oral tradition is measured and determined by eyewitnesses who tell their constituents, who retell it. They in turn tell it within the community, who then can tell if it's false or not, because they're still living eyewitnesses who have also been trained in the same story to reinforce what has already been explained to them. It's about verification. So in actual fact, when they are giving an oral tradition, it was about verification, meaning making sure that it's the collective memory that is being told the way that it's been passed down. Let's take it a step further. Safrai, another scholar in this field of oral tradition, produced some amazing facts about first century oral tradition. So let's put this in context of the life of Jesus with the eyewitnesses, his contemporaries, who wrote the 27 books of the New Testament, the canon of Scripture. This is what he says in his chapter entitled Education and the Study of the Torah, from volume 2 of his classic work known as The Jewish People in the First Century. Okay, so talk about specificity, okay? He says this, Safrai explains how the Jewish children were trained in memorization. Quote, the teacher explained the halakhic item or the midrash and encouraged the student to participate actively in asking questions and explaining them. But he also demanded memory work and a constant effort to remember the actual text, individual and group study of the Bible, repetition of the passages, etc. Were often done by chanting them aloud. This was the only way to overcome the danger of forgetting. Man, so this is what we have to understand, my friends. When we are listening to someone like Joe Rogan, and we can get intimidated, we can get overwhelmed, but all you have to do is reality check it. And that's why I appreciate you guys taking a listen, watching this video to, again, to stand strong against these opposing worldviews. So when you look at how accurate oral tradition was, but when you look at the gospel accounts, the letters from Paul and Peter and Jude and James and John, they were writing these things down, and the church fathers, they accepted the gospels. They accepted Paul's writings. And the thing that Joe Rogan never gets at is, how do you even know they were hijacked? If you haven't really looked at the transmission of the New Testament, going back to even to the traditions of the Old Testament that we talked about a minute ago, who are you talking about who hijacked? How are they able to take the thousands of manuscripts that they have and going into other Syriac and Coptic languages and try to hijack all of them? If in fact that's the case, then we'd be able to pull from all of these manuscripts to show that they have been completely botched or hijacked. Now, here's the difference though. When you're looking at textual criticism, there are discrepancies, meaning there's different arrangement of words, right? But the substance of what they teach factually, historically, and theologically are sound, 100%. So there is no distortion. Saint Athanasius, who's the bishop of Alexandria, he wrote in 367 what is known as the Festal Letters. This is probably one of the most premier fathers in Alexandria, right? The helm that Alexander the Great built, right? So he has a library. He has an access to information beyond anyone's scope at that time. And he gives a thorough examination of the 27 books of the New Testament. And guess what? Guess what St. Athanasius found? He found that they uphold to the teachings of Jesus. They uphold to the early church beliefs, that they are very consistent as he was looking at manuscript after manuscript after manuscript after manuscript, and consistently seeing the accuracy of these manuscripts and seeing the authority from these apostles that were reflecting the authority that of the prophets of the Old Testament. And he sees these in abundance of antiquity he has access to. So when we get then to the English translation, my friends, we can hold fast to what we have is accurate and it's true. So to say because we don't know Hebrew, or to say that there's a bunch of hijackers who distorted and botched the Bible, we can't hold it to be credible, therefore Christianity is not true. That's ultimately the conclusion that Joe Rogan gets to in most of his videos, if you watch, when he's talking specifically about the Bible and Christianity. So, my friends, that's reality checking Joe Rogan. I pray that that has been an encouragement to you guys, that you can make better sense of how you could respond and stand strong as a Christian in this culture. If you like this video, make sure you guys hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe. I appreciate it so much for you guys taking the time watching this video and being a part of the work that we're doing to help you continue to stand strong in your faith. Until next time, keep standing strong, my friends.